Right now we have, or I have the distinct honor of introducing our keynote speaker and someone who I had the privilege of meeting at a conference previously when we were focusing on various issues going on in the Middle East. And I'm just so pleased that we were able to host him here at Rutgers University. So the Honorable Ambassador Ebrahim Rasool was South Africa's ambassador to the United States of America from 2010 until 2015. Prior to that, he served as a member of Parliament in the National Assembly, Special Advisor to the President of the Republic of South Africa and Premier Governor of the Western Cape Province. His life has been shaped by a commitment to justice and coexistence and forged through participation and leadership in the anti-apartheid struggle. This started in high school and included leadership in the United Democratic Front and the African National Congress. He made sacrifices like spending time in prison, where he met Nelson Mandela for the first time, and being under house arrest. Ambassador Ebrahim Rasool's social and political involvement has been faith-driven through both the Islamic movement as a founder of the Call of Islam, as well as the interfaith movement. He mobilized Muslims in the broader faith communities to develop deeper understanding of Islam and faith under the prevailing conditions of globalization in the world today. His extensive government experience was instrumental in attracting foreign investment into the province worth approximately $1 billion. For his contributions to South Africa, Ambassador Rasool has received a number of leadership awards, Visionary Leadership and Public Good Award from the World Congress of Muslim Philanthropists in 2008, Commitment and Leadership in the Fight Against Crime from Business Against Crime in 2009, the 2005 London Financial Times Foreign Direct Investment Personality of the Year Award, the Nelson Mandela Award for Health and Human Rights presented to him by the Kaiser Family Foundation in 1998, the inaugural Presidential Award for Outstanding Commitment from the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., and the Indonesian Diasporian of 2012 Award. Founder of the World for All Foundation, Ambassador Rasool is active in rethinking the intellectual tools for cooperative relations between faiths, cultures, and communities at a global level, and establishing justice, dignity, and inclusion and equity for those marginalized and excluded, which among others are expressed through the One Africa initiative. He is also a senior fellow at Georgetown University. So with that, I just want to make a small personal note to say that we are so fortunate to have Ebrahim Rasool here. He is, anyone who has met him in person feels his warmth and his brilliance and his leadership. And I know that there are many Rutgers students who actually were extremely excited that you were coming here. You have, just to confirm, you have an international following, including a very, very strong following here, literally at Rutgers University. And so with that, thank you so much, Ambassador Ebrahim Rasool, and we welcome you to Rutgers University.
Thank you very much, Professor Sahar Aziz, who is one of the most decisive people I've known. She encountered me at the conference in Istanbul, said that you must do the keynote, and within 2 weeks, the invitations were there. I thought she was the dictator of Rutgers, but I've now come to understand that there is a boss called people like Barbara Lee and David and others, but that she is persuasive enough to ensure that Rutgers picks up a path and that Rutgers remains a courageous institution. The fact that we are here today is a sign of courage. The fact that we discuss Islamophobia and populism in the United States today is a sign of enormous courage. It is the intellectual honesty that must define a university, that we too cannot become populist. We too cannot do what is instinctive. We've got to do what is right. What is not popular must be the subject of persuasion and engagement to make the unpopular popular, not because we are dictators, but because it is the right thing to do. And so, in a sense, this is a conference to say that the hysteria that globalization is sometimes capable of will not interrupt the transmission of ideas, the engagement of the intellect, and even if there is social distance, we must find ways to continue with scholarship and with debate. And that, I think, Barbara, is the significance of what we do under these dystopian conditions today. We continue because there is a contagion that is not just coronavirus. There's a contagion of bigotry in the world. There's a contagion of populism in the world. And we cannot choose which contagion to respect and which contagion are off limits. And so, in a sense, we deal with all contagion in a conference like this. Because sometimes we all love the mobility of capital and goods that is wrought by globalization, but we want to close down the borders when people too assert their mobility, when diseases assert their mobility and the borderlessness that on the one hand we welcome and on the other hand we try to push back. And that, I think, is what is on about today. Our experience in the world we live in is benignly put as a loss of civility, a loss of decent argumentation. Why can't we be nice in the exchange of ideas? But it is not just a loss of civility in that regard. It is a loss of respect for each other's humanity sometimes, because we dehumanize so easily. It's a loss of dignity because we tolerate inequality and poverty and marginalization. And so this loss of civility isn't just about debate, it's about the condition of life that we find ourselves in. There is an experience today that the middle that used to integrate us, that used to unify us, is no more, and that it is the victim of the rise of binaries, the rise of extremes. And it's the extremes that often dominate the debate and consume the middle and hollow it out from the inside. We have seen the movement of these extremes from the margins of society, where before they used to be in the caves of the Tora Bora in Afghanistan, in the desert of Raqqa in Syria, and such places, the far side of Nigeria, etc. Today, the extremes are mainstreamed. They're in respectable garb. They run governments, such as in India, in Myanmar, in Hungary, and they're even in the White House. They sit in parliaments, bastions of civility and liberalism. The Scandinavian countries are managing them. In parliaments, they occupy 30% of the French parliament, even a major hold, not yet threatening, in the Dutch parliament. That's where the extremes are mainstream today. They are on the soccer fields of Europe, where if you happen to be a star and your team loses, you will be pilloried as a black, a Muslim, and a foreigner. And so this is where the extremes are now mainstreamed. Before, the extremes were nihilistic in spectacular ways. They blew themselves up. They destroyed others with bombs. They had daring shootings in public. Today, they are nihilistic in insidious ways. They make laws that exclude. They remove countries from bigger unities. They define through legislation who are citizens and who are not citizens. They can foment violence and they can foment war, all with a legal signature. But it makes them no less extreme, before there was a moral consensus that such behavior was wrong. Today, there is moral equivocation. Maybe they have a cause. Maybe they were excluded. Maybe the Midwest is sensitive. Maybe they are grieving their loss. And so we give them a free pass. And so we have this collective experience today of a rising intolerance, prejudice, and discrimination, of rising hostility and conflict, which are both tolerated and sometimes justified. We have the experience of legalized exclusion through citizen amendment acts, travel bans, and others. Of otherization, we deal with people through labels and caricature, not through the human beings that we encounter. We have this overwhelming experience of the rise of impunity. Actions will not have consequences. If you can get away with it, please do. It's legalized, it's tolerated evil. When intolerance was marginal, we had a name for it. We called it fundamentalism. We called it extremism. We called it terrorism. Now we find respectable names for mainstreamed intolerance. We call it populism. Because it both expresses a legitimate way to the mainstream through elections and the legitimate exercise of power called governance. And therefore, we ascribe legitimate grievance to the causes of populism. And we spend more time examining what makes people discriminate, hostile, and attack, rather than what is the impact on those who are the victims of such populism. I come from South Africa. We've had 300 plus long years of visual, visible evil. It culminated in its final iteration as apartheid. But that was only the final 50 years. The genetic makeup was made over 300 years ago. It was built on the colonialism that involved, on the one hand, the collective that we can call the original sin. The original sin of dispossession, colonial dispossession. The original sin of a human discrimination, justified in poetry like The White Man's Burden, to Christianize and to civilize. Achieved by genocide of the first people of South Africa, the Khoi and the San, the death of their language and their culture, the slavery, the enslavement of the early Muslims who were brought from Indonesia, South Asia, and other parts of Africa as slaves to work for their colonial masters. Wars of dispossession against the indigenous people of South Africa, repression of all those who were other, inscribing on them micro-identities so that cohesion in response to this colonial original sin was always elusive, and ensured through hierarchical access to benefits and rights, lawmaking for every life event, who you could marry, which school you could go to, which future you could dream of, where you could live, and what you could aspire to. Apartheid was simply the apotheosis, the high point, the scientific moment at which all of these came together in legislative, intellectual, ideological, and other forms. Apartheid was the final mainstreaming of this built-in evil. It was extremism justified by its mission, which was to civilize and to Christianize. Most crucially, we must understand it is not simply a disposition towards the other. It is the exercise of power over the other. The centrality of power gives an inert disposition, a social force, an economic force, a societal force that transforms the inert into the active and the pernicious. Hindutva was an attitude until Modi found the PowerPoint into which to plug into. Racial intolerance was pervasive in the US until Trump found the plug. Buddhism wasn't even imagined to be hostile or aggressive until some found the plug that gave them the power. And so, if we keep Islamophobia and the related bigotries to its dispositional level, we will do all kinds of symbolic stuff. We will make short-term bargains with those in power in order that they may like us. And sometimes, as Nelson Mandela taught us, the gesture is crucial, but it is not sufficient because you are confronting power. And therefore, we need to understand how to get to that plug, how to switch it off, and make sure that it never is powered up again. What made apartheid easy to fight was that in those days, the enemy, if I can use that term, was clear and visible, distinguished by its skin color. It was white. Sometimes the uniforms that it wore, the army and the police uniforms, and they lived in the privileged parts of South Africa. That made apartheid easy to fight, and also at the same time made the temptation easy to make whites the object and the subject of our anger. What made apartheid difficult to fight was not simply that it was the most powerful military on the African continent, were the only place in Africa where nuclear weapons had been given to it. What made it difficult to fight was that we understood that the day after the revolution, our oppressors were there to stay. The challenge of what to do with those that you fight today was absolutely crucial in understanding the strategy and tactics of your struggle. We weren't in a Mozambican situation where the Portuguese would leave after decolonization, or in the Algerian situation where the French had another home. Our oppressors were homegrown over 300 years, and they were there to stay. So the modalities of struggle was absolutely crucial. And so the anti-apartheid struggle therefore became a complex struggle, a nuanced struggle. It was a severe test for the age-old African philosophy of Ubuntu. I am because you are. We are people through other people. The essential statement of the interdependence of human beings, whether you like each other or not. And out of that, our struggle was not just to prevent the dehumanization of African people, either at the hands of their oppressors, who sought to dehumanize them, to strip them of any element of human dignity, or through our anger that may in turn dehumanize us as we respond to the evil that was done against us. In South Africa, as Mandela taught us, our struggle was not simply to prevent our dehumanization, but to also have the mission to humanize those who were oppressing us. That therefore means that how you think about the situation we find ourselves in when we are the victims of any or all bigotries, we've got to place the humanity of those who are deemed their victims and the perpetrators into relief. That was the challenge of the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. It meant that we needed to distinguish between the system of oppression and the people who ran the system. Not because we wanted to pull away from engaging them in struggle, but our own humanity depended on not demonizing whites as whites, but as cogs in a system. And so, in the way in which we populate a toolbox in the fight against Islamophobia and all related bigotries, we've got to place that tool in the center spot of why we do what we do. It is about our humanity and taking responsibility for the humanity of those who run the system that oppress us. Secondly, we understood from that founding block, that foundation, that our methodology of struggle had to be different. Moral ends require moral means. You cannot fight for a non-discriminating, in our case, a non-racial society by mobilizing race. You cannot fight for a society free of Islamophobia by blaming Jews and becoming guilty of anti-Semitism. You cannot fight for freedom and equality for all, but hate the LGBTQI+. You cannot fight for peace, but let loose the demons of warlordism and violence. And so even when the ANC had a guerrilla army, it proscribed what that army could and could not do. It made civilian casualties a no-no. It targeted military installations as opposed to people. If your objective is a reconciled and peaceful nation at the end of the struggle, it's about expanding out and building the middle ground and isolating only the most extreme oppressors. When you know who the extreme oppressors are in the fomenting of Islamophobia and every other bigotry, that's who you go for. Everyone else is a potential recruit. Everyone else is a potential recruit into the middle ground. It even affects the way in which we define justice. Justice in its most absolute form may require such a relentless pursuit of it that you may never have enough peace. to pursue it. We invented the term transitional justice. Simply put, a justice that takes you from the horror where you are to the future that you want. It implies sufficient pragmatism of strategy, not of values. We also understood the notion of restorative justice, a justice that is incremental over time, that may start, in the South African sense, with human dignity, human rights then, and then human needs. And so, within the South African experience was the Muslim experience. Muslims have been in South Africa for just about 350 years. The first 150 years, Muslims were essentially drawn from two groups. One were the anti-colonial leaders of Southeast Asia, princes and scholars who preached against colonialism and were brought to exile in South Africa. The other were the artisans who were enslaved to do the work of the Dutch colonialists in Cape Town. But for that entire 150 years, the first 150 years, Islam was a banned religion. You could not practice it, you could not live it, you could not show it. The burial sites of those early founders were all on the outskirts of Cape Town because that's where they went to escape this law. For 200 years from the beginning, Muslims were largely enslaved. For 300 years, they were the subjects of racism and Islamophobia and related intolerances. The manifestation of Islamophobia towards Muslims over the 325 years was that the proscription of their worship, the dispossession of their land and possessions, the indignification of Muslims. Our child was born, our first child, in 1991, before Nelson Mandela was free, but apartheid was not over. We registered her at the Home Affairs Department as illegitimate, because anyone issuing from a Muslim marriage was deemed illegitimate. I put this to you simply to show what Islamophobia, when perfected and institutionalized, can bring about over a period like that. But Muslims also distinguished themselves in the way in which they were able to fight for freedom. They were subjected to assassination. The most famous example, Imam Abdullah Harun, killed, tortured to death in a prison in South Africa. They were jailed. Nelson Mandela was on Robben Island and in prison for 27 years. Ahmad Kathrada was in the cell right next to him for 26 years. And they were in exile. Oliver Tambo was in exile for 30 years. Next to him, dying in exile, was Dr. Yusuf Dadoo. And so, the Muslim response to this, and this is probably quite useful in trying to understand how do we fight Islamophobia. The Muslim response to this was always between the instinct for co-option and the option for confrontation. And the ulama of the time often tended towards co-option. The outliers were those who joined national movements, communist movements, etc. There were those who in later years were inspired by the Iranian Revolution or the Muslim Brotherhood and had standalone options for them. the strand from which I would come, and many others in the Call of Islam, was that an organization like the Call of Islam, immediately affiliated to the liberation movement, as well as Archbishop Desmond Tutu's interfaith movement. And so we understand the need to insert ourselves into greater unities than ourselves, and not to monopolize and wallow in our victimhood, as opposed to the victimhood of many others who were even far more severely treated under apartheid. In the last section I want to deal with is, how do we begin to populate out of the South African lessons, both the general anti-apartheid and the Muslim struggle, certain instruments for a toolbox against populism and the discriminations and the bigotries that it spawns. Firstly, we've understood in South Africa, Muslims and the general population, that we should not let the populists or the oppressors dictate the terms and the terrain of how we experience what we experience. They'd like us to experience our own tailor-made oppressions, our own tailor-made bigotry, our own tailor-made suffering. What we've learned in South Africa is that we've got to treat populist bigotry as a genealogy, as a family. Muslims in South Africa were black by our terms and therefore subjected to racism, were Muslim and therefore Islamophobia, were seen as foreign, Malay or Indian and therefore xenophobia. 50% were women and therefore both an internal and an external misogyny and sexism. And so we had a choice. Which of those identities do we mobilize primarily and secondarily and then tertiarily? And which bigotry do we define as the overarching priority bigotry, while not forgetting the one that is directed at us, or the ones directed at us? While Islamophobia were unique to Muslims in South Africa, other bigotries provided points of connection with the majority population. And therefore, we understood as Muslims that the best way in South Africa to fight Islamophobia was to join in the fight against racism, for human rights, for freedom for all. And so the result was that rather than further self-isolate and stand apart, we inserted ourselves into greater unities and therefore asserting not only our own identity as Muslims, but also a greater identity as blacks and a national identity as South Africans. Always refusing to relinquish any one of those identities. Put simply, we made a choice to prioritize the pain of others in order to deal with our own pain. So that's one of the first instruments in a toolkit. The second one is focus on the siblings, but confront the genealogy. So if you can just imagine, it would have been on a slide, but I didn't want to take chances on a dystopian day like this. But if you can imagine, here is the family called bigotry. That's a catch-all for any discrimination and prejudice and so forth. Its grandparents are fear and ignorance. Fear is sometimes instinctive, and we've got to manage fears, but there's no excuse for ignorance. So you've got to fight ignorance. Its children are prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice may have dimensions of a natural prejudgment before you know something. You've heard something about the Chinese and you think, oh, is that it? That may be manageable, but you have no right to activate it into speech, thinking out loud, action, or discrimination. So we've got to collapse prejudice and fight its manifestation, its activation of discrimination. And the marriage of those two in turn give rise to a range of isms and phobias that constitute the siblings of the family called bigotry. And so we've got to all the time have that genealogy in mind, because you could fight the Islamophobe or the racist or the homophobe or the misogynist. But if you don't understand how to disable the gene, how to mutate the gene that comes from that genealogy, you would be like mopping all the time without closing the tap. And therefore, understanding that entire genealogy is what has allowed the leadership under Nelson Mandela to master the gesture of overcoming the natural fears and prejudices of people, inviting the Afrikaner elite to meet the ANC leadership, and they come back and they say, we discovered that they want the same things like us. Going out with the architect's wife, apartheid architect's wife, Betsy Verwoerd, having tea with her, and assuaging the kind of fears around which she had become a symbol. Donning the Springbok jersey when it was a symbol of white male virility and triumphalism in the world, putting it on, and effectively at that moment, blocking all attempts at counter-revolution. And so, we've got to be able to confront that entire genealogy. The third one is the idea of always having a vision to speak for you rather than simply rely on your anger and outrage to speak for you. We have a saying in South Africa, in Sotho, it says, your anger is hot, but it cannot cook. And so the point that I'm making is that we had a simple, unifying vision across the board that not even our oppressors could argue with. We said, we stand for 5 things: a united, non-racial, non-sexist, and democratic, free South Africa. Just those 5 things, no details. I think sometimes, for example, the Palestinians get lost in detail. How the borders, where this, who. Here we had a simple one that captured the moral imagination of the world and created one of the most important global solidarity movements, the anti-apartheid movement that the world had seen. And so that vision with clarity of strategy was absolutely crucial. And often your vision is tested not by how many times you espouse it, but how you live it. And so for Muslims, we found ourselves in the same struggle with people of other faiths. Some of us even went to our secular Jewish friends at the university and said, You've got to form this organization, and we'll help you form Jews for Justice. Because if Jews are going to be seen as on the other side, it will never be a respectable religion in South Africa. So you've got to take it up, whether you fast on Yom Kippur or not, or hold Shabbat, or whatever the case may be. So I think that actually becomes crucial for us. I've spoken about the fourth element in the toolbox already, Ubuntu, which is both a principle and a strategy, where the oppressed must take responsibility to humanize the oppressor, to unite the middle ground and continue expanding it. You know, that middle ground is like the train from Washington to New York. If there's an immediate need to leave Washington, everyone jumps on the train, but not everyone is going to end up in New York. Some will say, okay, Baltimore, we're fine, we feel safe, this is where we're getting off. Others will go on and they will get to another place, Penn Station in Pennsylvania, and they will say, okay, we're not here with you all the way to your terminus. We're getting off here. But the fact of the matter is that while we have people on a unified train, we've got to be able to engage. And as we learned in South Africa, and Muslims have difficulty learning it in the world today, not every partnership is a Catholic marriage. We need to understand that you enter into alliances when you share values. You enter into coalitions when you share objectives. And you enter into fronts when you share issues. It's like the train. The issue-based people get off in Baltimore. The coalition-based people get off in Pennsylvania. And the alliance people go all the way to New York. Now that's the strategic imagination, what I call the missing middle in Muslim thinking. Whether it is in the Arab Spring, or whether it is in the fight against Islamophobia. There is no tactical sense. We don't know what to do when the LGBT are standing at Dallas International Airport welcoming Muslims and giving legal advice to them despite the travel ban. We want a fatwa on it. We don't know what to do when Jews open clinics to discuss legal matters. And so we need to be able to understand how we work with other people. That's the success story of the South African struggle, and arguably why the South African community of Muslims is probably the happiest component of the Ummah in the world today, to such an extent that we now have a tendency that we misuse the freedom and respectability that we have to bring in the wrong people, the wrong teachings, and the wrong influences. The last one that I want to speak about is, out of the strategic sense, is to not see what we're up against as an undifferentiated experience, mass of experience, but always to apply the scalpel to separate out the chaff from the wheat. So often we are beleaguered that the balance of power is against us. And then we miss the opportunities in the balance of forces. Now, it comes from revolutionary speak, where we've understood that in apartheid South Africa, the balance of power was always in favor of the apartheid state. It controlled the institutions. It controlled the judiciary. It controlled the media. It controlled the bureaucracy. It had the army. It had the police. It had the power of repression. So the balance of power were never with us, and that's why the ANC never launched a full-scale revolutionary war, because in the balance of power, it is suicidal to launch an attack on the strong point, the power institutions of a society. But we saw the opportunities in the balance of forces. That's an identification of the motive forces of society. Who are the key movers and shakers of society? What are the universities doing? And how do we challenge universities to regain and retain and fight for their intellectual honesty in a time of danger? Remind them of their core mission and what scholarship is about. And then you begin to hear dissenting voices. Go to the churches and ensure that apartheid is declared a heresy. It's not simply enough that they pray for you. They've got to put their life on the line. They've got to call what they see not in diplomatic terms, because they're not ambassadors. They are truth tellers. And so the word encourage means to give courage. So it's not to nudge them along and to say, listen, we've got your back. If you go out and you say, what is happening is a heresy, and you use, and we got the imams in Cape Town to declare apartheid haram, forbidden, and we got the World Alliance of Reformed Churches to declare apartheid a heresy. It robs them of their legitimacy, which they think they've gotten through a populist vote. That's moving the balance of forces. It's understanding and believing in the instinct of people to be good. That something is withholding them from being good. And we need to be able to free them from their anxieties, from their fears. We've got to compensate for their ignorance by providing knowledge. And so, what we need to do is all the time operating in our zone of control, of influence, and of inspiration, and avoiding the zone of control until we have isolated the zone of control from its social forces. And so, I guess what I'm calling for in a description of the toolbox is for an intelligent assault on Islamophobia and all bigotries. Is for us to move from outrage to strategic news. It's for us to make partnerships, because even in religious terms, we're moving fast from competitive faith, although it clings to life, where we compete with each other for adherence and for supremacy of ideas and beliefs and all of those kind of things. We've moved a lot more to comparative faith, but it doesn't bring us too much to know how many days you're fasting and how we fast, etc. I think we're in the era of cooperative faith, where we are identifying some projects together. But what we need to understand is that we are in the battle for collaborative faith, where faith itself is being questioned at the hand of those who internally hijack the faith and externally blackmail us for our faith. And so we've got to have an intelligent fight, and it is possible. I think the Muslims of South Africa have shown that there is a better life under democracy. We did not spend our time debating, is democracy Islamic or not? We just knew it gives us a choice, rather than the choicelessness of apartheid. We understood that we needed to reach in as a guarantor that we will be believed when we reach out. And so the slaves from West Africa and East Africa who came there in their blackness encountered the Muslims, the Malay Muslims from Southeast Asia in their brownness, and said, you know, and Brother Zain, I think that this is probably what it is. It's to insert yourself into a bigger unity, into a history where I can respect this guy who's exiled here because he fought against colonialism there. It's one that said then, in apartheid South Africa, colonial South Africa, that if those who have enslaved us are doing it in the name of Christianity, then Islam must be a better religion. And so, it is the way in which we are able to reach in. But if anyone looks at us today, and they see us doing this against Shia, because we're Sunni, how can they trust us when we say, no, we'll be nice to you? If they see us having this default in which we refuse or are unable to make a distinction between Judaism as a religion and Zionism as a political ideology, and we think of it all as the same. In fact, the responsibility to humanize Jews is to insist that I see you as a Jew. You will be dealt with differently as a Zionist, but I will not denigrate your faith. We've got to take responsibility for that, whether they like it or not. And so I think that the idea of developing a toolbox, given the depth and the expanse of bigotries in the world, and Islamophobia particularly, and this energy that it's gotten from this wave of mainstream populism, means that we can't simply be complaining and blaming all the time. We can't be victims. We've got to become agents. Thanks very much.